A quick look at the clock means it is time for the press preview, our first look at the front pages as they arrive. Over the remainder of the hour, we'll take a look at what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the Daily Telegraph's leader writer Tim Stanley. To them in just a second, but let's take a look at the front pages in our inbox. Well, with the headline, Britain steps up to lead the world. The Express welcomes a deal struck by the leading global economies to ensure corporations are made to pay their fair share of tax. Here's the Mirror. It reports that the Labour Party is demanding that the government use the money from the tax deal to fund hospitals and schools. The Telegraph has word that plans are underway to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds in August. That is, of course, just before the start of the new school year. Meanwhile, the Observer understands that the PM is being lobbied to share more of the UK's vaccine supply with developing nations, or else it may not be possible to reach the landmark deal on climate change expected at the G7 summit in Cornwall. Here's Scotland on Sunday. It reports on concerns in the hospitality sector that the go-ahead for fan zones in Glasgow for Euro 2020 presents a substantial risk for the spreading of COVID. This could mean food and drink vendors not turning a profit. Well, let's stick with Scottish matters, and according to The Times, Buckingham Palace plans to have the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge spend a great deal of time north of the border to shore up support for staying in the Union. The Mail reports that the Home Secretary has ordered social media giants to remove posts that glamorise illegal channel crossing. And The Star hears that the actor John Barrowman has withdrawn from pantomime after reports emerged that he'd exposed himself on the set of Doctor Who and Torchwood. He has, of course, insisted the incidents took place as part of practical jokes. Might just skip over that story tonight. We are joined, as you can see, by Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. Lovely to see you both this evening. And we're going to devote all our time in this particular quarter to what is being described as a very big story. Tim, take us to the front of the Sunday Express and explain exactly why Rishi Sunak, you can just see at the bottom left of the screen there, is looking so pleased with himself.
This is a very big moment in the economic history of the world, and Britain is going to claim leadership for it. The Tories are going to say, people said, what will Britain be like after Brexit? Well, this is what it's like, tackling tax evasion. What is the big issue that this has addressed? It is that multinationals can do the vast majority of their business in one country and make a lot of money out of doing that. But because they are resident in another country with a very, very low tax rate, they can escape paying the amount of tax they really ought to pay that's proportionate to the amount of business they've done and the amount of profit they've made. In other words, they're getting away without paying a fair share of tax. And what Britain is claiming credit for here is bringing the G7 together to coordinate the agreement to levy a minimum tax of 15% corporation tax, which means that wherever you do business, that is the amount of tax that you must pay. Now, to get the leading economies of the world to agree to what is essentially a form of tax harmonization, admittedly, which sets the bar quite low. Joe Biden wanted the figure to be something more like 21%, but they settled on 15%. This is a very real accomplishment. And it deals, as I said, with this problem of how do you tax the new industries? How do you get around the challenge of tax evasion? And Britain is going to spend the next few days claiming leadership on it.
Rachel, it would be easy to be quite cynical about this, given that this problem has existed since, well, in my mind, since time immemorial, and there have been efforts to try and fix it. I suppose the question is, how does one compel the rest of the world to sign up to this? We're already hearing noises from places like Ireland, of course, that it might not be entirely what they want to do.
No, and of course there's going to be pushback from, particularly from countries who do operate currently low tax havens, and Ireland would be one of those. But we also have to observe that it is a bit peculiar that the UK is claiming the credit for this. The UK was actually, caught somewhat by surprise to the extent that they wanted climate change issues to be on the agenda. I believe that was what Rishi Sunak was planning to discuss in these negotiations that were Joe Biden and US-led. And it was actually the UK that was one of the countries that drove the rate down from Biden's initial proposal of 21%. Now, many critics of this policy are saying 15% simply isn't enough. Plus, the way that this is structured will mean that it actually predominantly benefits G7 countries at the expense of developing countries. But I think that those serious concerns notwithstanding, this is a huge thing. To have a globally agreed attempt to mitigate the worst excesses of multinationals' tax avoidance, who, as you say, this has been going on for decades. It's got worse and worse, with tech giants in particular being identified as the most sort of aggressive pursuers of tax avoidance. So we're looking at companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Netflix, companies, it has to be said, whose profits have skyrocketed during the pandemic. And so, this idea that the world is no longer engaging in a sort of race to the bottom in terms of low corporation tax, I do think that is something to be heralded and welcomed.
Tim, as we bring in the front of the Observer, and again, kind of similar reporting by them, they're describing it as a landmark deal as well. I mean, ultimately, we've heard this evening that at least a couple of the major tech firms are relatively sanguine. They say that they welcome this. Do you think that's the situation, or have they just read the writing on the wall?
I think they've read the writing on the wall, and it's proof of what power democracies enjoy when they club together and work together multinationally. By the way, in the beginning, in my first answer, it's a bit late, and I referred to tax evasion. I should have said tax avoidance. My apologies. They are two different things.
Of course.
What's changed here to change the dimension, to change the dynamic of this, is Joe Biden's election. Hitherto, G7s, for the last few G7s, have not been terribly productive. And that's because Donald Trump was leading the United States. And whether you agree with his agenda or not, his agenda was America first. In other words, he saw global relations through the prism of national competition. For him, others describe that as a race to the bottom. What do I have to do to set tax rates at a certain level, to set spending at a certain level, whereby I can make America the front runner? Joe Biden has a completely different economic philosophy. He is spending big at home. He's keen to raise certain taxes. And he also wants to work together with developing countries to make the forums like the G7 productive again, in order to get things which have been delayed for the last few years, not just the issue of tax avoidance, but also climate change, to get those things addressed. So really, although Britain will claim leadership here, and it certainly helps that the G7 will be having its meeting next week in Cornwall, so that's a very good stage for Britain to strut about on, what's really changed the dynamic is US leadership. And it is for many of us ironic who have been following American politics for some time to see particularly Janet Yellen's role in all of this, because she was so cautious under the Obama presidency about interest rates and about spending. She was seen as somewhat fiscally conservative. And now she's on the other side of the argument. And most central banks are moving towards the other side of the argument. They are embracing printing money. They are encouraging governments to spend more. Although we've been through these twin revolutions of Trump and Brexit, which give the impression that world politics and economics have moved to the right, it couldn't be further from the truth. There is still a globalist consensus. There is still a multilateral consensus. And actually, in the last few months, partly because of the context of COVID, it's getting a lot done.
Rachel, we'll go to the front of the Telegraph, and again, similar reporting there, but an interesting nugget further down in the piece, pointing out that, of course, Mr Sunak himself had actually, before entering government, cited reduced rates of corporation tax as one of a series of possible incentives for businesses choosing to operate within the Freeport system. I mean, does it matter that there is a slight divergence from Mr Sunak's previous position? We always understand that people's politics change, and of course the global situation has dramatically changed since the point that he was outside government.
I don't think it would matter had it not been that Sunak and the government is now crowing about leading this breakthrough deal, which is what's happening. So, Rishi Sunak is, of course, free to change his mind and to evolve his position, as we all do. But for him to now say, well, this is amazing, and for the government to say this is, for the Express to say this is what, post-Brexit Britain looks like, is absolutely absurd, given that this is not where they are in terms of corporate tax. It certainly interferes with the free ports policy, as the Telegraph is describing. And crucially, it wasn't them that led this. It was Joe Biden. It was the US. As Tim is saying, that is the major shift in all this. And, it is true that Joe Biden has changed his approach to economics. He's, recently spoken about it being the end of, trickle-down economics, that it's not a thing, that it doesn't work. It does seem like even Joe Biden, who, I would not define as particularly left-wing. In fact, if anything, he's, a centrist moderate. I think he's just seen the reality that we are in. And that reality is one of, spending, of government spend, of Keynesian economics, and of actually calling out that trickle-down economics does not work and has produced the world's most rampant inequalities.
Of course, Tim. I mean, we could equally say the Conservatives on this side of the pond have looked at their economic policies in the past and have decided to go in a slightly different direction. But as we take a look at the Sunday Mirror, perhaps the least surprising exclusive of the weekend is that the Labour Party is suggesting that the dividend that we will receive from this should be spent on the health service and on education.
Yes, and the Tories will come under pressure to do both those things. They're also keen to spend on infrastructure. In fact, apart from foreign aid, the Conservative Party seems keen to spend on most things. And that's the other side of this. There is a philosophical shift that's taking place. In some ways, there's continuity. David Cameron was very keen on tackling tax avoidance too, and tax evasion too. David Cameron was also very keen on tackling climate change. But there's a big irony at the heart of all of this, that Brexit was very much pushed by the Thatcherite wing of the Conservative Party, who always imagined that the point of Brexit was that after it, you would slash regulations and slash taxes and probably cut spending and turn Britain into a sort of dynamic free market buccaneering economy like they imagine Singapore is. It looks like we're going to get the complete opposite, that after Brexit, partly to keep hold of the working class voters that Boris has won over, there's going to be more spending. There's this shift towards global tax harmonisation, which, by the way, undermines British sovereignty. No, you can't do free ports or have Northern Ireland set a really low corporation tax rate if you sign up to this sort of thing. Plus, we're also seeing Britain on board with the climate change agenda. In other words, the Conservative Party, in order to win a majority and in order to stay in power, has moved to the left. And the right of the Tory party, who were the geniuses behind Brexit, have got to ask themselves, how did we end up here? How did we end up with Boris, the classical liberal, doing this with the Conservative Party?
Unfortunately, we have to take a break. Otherwise, I'd have really enjoyed hearing from both of you as to exactly how we got to that particular position. Guys, we will take a pause for just a second. Coming up after the break is a charm offensive from the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, the secret to keeping Scotland in the Union. We'll ponder that next. Welcome back to the press preview. Tim and Rachel still with us. And Rachel, we'll come to you in just a second. But I want to give our viewers two kind of not unrelated stories. The first on the front of The Observer, the headline there. Share vaccines or the climate deal will fail, rich countries are being told, the UK presumably included within that. And then the front of the Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, which is also talking about vaccines, but in terms of the plan to jab 12-year-olds before the new school year. We're in a situation at the moment, Rachel, where the vaccination programme is going pretty well, but everyone in this country wants to see life returning to normal just as soon as possible. How much moral pressure do you think there is, and indeed should be, on the politicians to share the stocks that we have, given the most vulnerable in this country have generally had both their vaccines?
I do think that the unequal global distribution of vaccines is a real failure. It's a real, as a civilization, as a humanity, humanity has failed. When you look at the stats, of the 2 billion shots that have gone into people's arms, only 0.3% of those are in low-income countries. And I find it peculiar, the sort of things that are being applied as pressure points, i.e., the climate deal will fail if developing countries aren't given more vaccines. Well, first of all, I think that's peculiar reading. This is apparently what Boris Johnson has been advised. You know, developing countries are the ones that are driving the pressure to address climate change, not least because they're the countries that are, you know, the most suffering from the effects of climate change, which has been caused mostly by developed countries. But it's interesting that that's being applied as a pressure point. Also, the idea that, you know, the world needs to get vaccinated so that all of us can be safe, you know, i.e. variants will emerge in other countries if the vaccines aren't applied globally. So these are sort of seem like self-interested reasons, as opposed to just saying, look, it's just the right thing to do to make sure that the entire world is vaccinated in an equal pace. And I think that this whole idea of getting rich countries to stop hoarding vaccines, stop buying them up and actually share them more equally is absolutely the right thing to do. But it gets away from the main issue here, which is patents. So the UK, along with and other countries, are blocking requests from the developing world, 100 plus countries, to waive the patents on vaccines so that they can be produced and distributed nationally. That's something that needs to change immediately.
Tim, I just want to squeeze in the story. We'll return to both of these, in fact, in the 11 o'clock hour. But I just want to squeeze in the story on the front of the Sunday Times that we teased, that the palace is sending for Prince William to rescue the Union. What's your thought? What are your thoughts? Is he the man for the job?
It's really interesting to see the royal family thinking that it has to take a much more visible role in the next referendum, if there is one. During the last one, the Queen limited herself to saying that she hoped people would think carefully about the future. And of course, you could read that either way. You could think carefully about the future and say, and I've decided the best thing to do is to vote for independence. So it was a very carefully couched expression. This is different. This suggests that the royal family want to be more involved in a political decision that they see affecting them because it's a constitutional decision. So it doesn't entirely surprise me. Will it work? They're very popular, and they're certainly more popular than politicians, and they are 10 times more popular.
That wouldn't be difficult, Tim. Sorry to interrupt. Just, Rachel, a very quick word on this. I mean, he is more popular. 69% of voters in Scotland have a positive view of William, apparently.
No, you're absolutely right. And it wouldn't be difficult to get a positive rating than politicians, particularly Boris Johnson, who polls very low in Scotland. But I just think, people might like the royal family in Scotland, maybe, but that doesn't, I don't think that's really going to cut it. And it seems a little bit desperate to me.
As I say, guys, we will return to both those stories in the 11 o'clock hour. For now, though, thanks very much indeed. Time for us to have a look at the weather.